back then, but also revealed to me that um, even though it was a hellish time, it was also really a holy time. And I think that's what's happening now. Like, I feel like the closer we get to woundedness and people being marginalized, the more that there's a kind of opening up to grace. And for me, my decision to work in the AIDS community was not by choice. It was purely mistake and something I would not have chosen. But it did shape my whole career. And I was out of nursing school in Southern Virginia, and I was straight, didn't really know very many gay folk at all. Grew up in a pretty homogenous community outside Baltimore. I felt like my, experiences were very narrow. And here I landed myself on a general medicine floor at GW in '85, and it was a subspecialty AIDS unit. And I had no interest in being there. I did not feel particular warmth toward the community. I was personally terrified, and it was a real struggle. And I lived in a group house, and the folks in my group house were terrified for me and for them. And there was just lots of fear and hatred. And I remember it was really profound, and that whatever was happening in society, I felt like I was a little ashamed that I also felt a little bit of that, but yet I was called to care for people. And you can't care for people that you fear. And that became something that I took to work with me every day. So 3 weeks into the job, I actually got a finger stick. And so that made it even a more profound personal experience. And on the day that I had my finger stick, I left the patient's room to try to pull myself together. It was a pretty bad finger stick, and I was pretty angry that I had to be taking care of these folks. And when I came back and sat with the patient at the bedside, the door opened and the room was dark, and in came a little tiny woman, and she was unmasked and ungowned and ungloved. And at that time, we were fully wearing PPP. We were very protected in our clothing. And she came in completely unprotected, and she came up and embraced the patient and told him he was loved. And that woman was Mother Teresa. And I just, having her come at that time, when I was at most of my really amazing visceral place of hatred and disgust and fear and all those bad emotions that I didn't want to feel, but I was feeling them. And I felt a little bit like that had left me. It was kind of an opening up to grace. And so the weeks went on, and I just continued to pursue the path of love and kindness and acceptance, and learning more about the reality of the marginalization of the community. I witnessed so many moms and dads that were coming to find out that their sons were gay at the same time they were dying. Everybody died, and everybody suffered severely. And I really became a fierce advocate. I went from being not wanting to care for them to passionately wanting to care for them. And it was just a really beautiful thing. And so soon after I've had this conversion experience, which I can't say it was anything but a conversion experience, I went to my little faith community at the Potter's House, and I sounded a call to other people who might want to share in my mission. And my mission was to create a buddy system so that I could have people in the community who cared about AIDS to buddy along with my patients, because my patients were isolated from their families, partners that could sometimes not come in. They were very, very isolated. And so about 5 people joined my little group, and we called ourselves the AIDS Mission Group. We also had like a little coffee house at the Potter's House for folks to meet each other on Saturday nights, called our Crossroads AIDS Community. And there was a real richness to it. We started making quilt panels, and we were walking in the AIDS walks eventually. And each person who buddied with somebody, that was a very, very close relationship. And then David Hilfiker, who was working at Christ House as a physician. More patients were coming into Christ House, which is an infirmary for homeless. And they came, he came to me and said he wanted to join the little mission group. And then we started talking about a residential community for people with AIDS. And so then the Joseph's House was born in 1990. But those 5 years from 1985 to 1990, I just got totally enveloped into the AIDS community, the gay community. I'd say my husband, when we met at that time, he's like, "Do you have any friends who aren't gay?" which was so such a difference from where I had come. You know, like I literally spent every weekend with my patients. You know, they weren't just patients; they became friends. And I went to a lot of funerals. I advocated for churches to have funerals. At the time, only the Quakers and the Unitarians and our little faith community, and Foundry Methodist, Dumbarton Methodist, you know, those were the communities where they had larger gay communities and were welcoming of funerals. But it just shocked me that people weren't willing to celebrate people's lives at the church. I also was involved in the political activism of getting Mother Teresa's house started in Northeast. She was going to create an infirmary called Gift of Peace, like the Gift of Love in New York City. So we worked on that together. And it was just it probably was the high point of my life for those years. Even now I can look back and say those were the holy years between 1985 and 1990. I left GW, I helped start Joseph's House, went back to graduate school, and end-of-life activism is what I call it, because I had to fight for them to get good end-of-life care, and I'm still fighting. There weren't that many treatments then, and the treatments that people did have were pretty miserable, and I felt like the community sacrificed themselves for some very toxic drugs so that we could have the drugs that we have now that are effective and minimal side effects. And I have a few, in my geriatric work now, I have a few patients who are long-term survivors, and I often, you know, we talk about what it was like back then and, you know, how long it took to get medications. And anyway, when I watch the news now and I see the nurses on the front lines and the camaraderie and you know, it's hard, but I feel a little jealous of them. You know, I know that what they're going through is a powerful experience of joy. And it's real pure joy. And it's joy because it's coupled with such pain and suffering. But anyway, that's my journey. This morning I decided to watch a few trailers of some of the old movies. There were some great old movies, and I'll read some of their titles because they might ring a bell to you. But of course, Rent, Normal Heart, which was amazing. It was a great play at the Arena stage. When the Band Played On, We Were Here, How to Survive a Plague, Common Threads Quilt, Angels in America, Lazarus Effect, which was about AIDS in Africa, Early Frost, the Dallas Buyers Club, which was so great, and Philadelphia with Tom Hanks. And it's just like seeing these little trailers this morning, just was like, you know, thinking that was such an amazing time in human history. And I think it was the groundwork for what we have now with antivirals and alternative therapies, you know, because there were no treatments. You know, the whole alternative therapy movement was started from the AIDS community. I really believe that. So anyway, but Dr. Fauci, I remember going to conferences with Dr. Fauci and to see him now, like his whole life committed to antiviral work is pretty exciting. And he's really somebody I deeply admire. So that's my story. You know, it's been a blessed journey, and I'm grateful for it.
Thank you, Dixcy. That was beautiful. Next, we'll have Chris. So the floor is yours, Chris.
Hi, everybody. Wow, Dixcy, what a moving story, and so many commonalities between yours and mine. and differences too. I didn't realize it was going to be movie recommendation list as well. But you know, we're all desperate for other stuff to watch. That's a great list, and to that I would add The Nurses of Ward 5B.
Oh, definitely. I just saw that. I
Unbelievable.
loved it. Yeah. It just came out like 6 months ago. It's a great film.
Yes, very moving about people really stepping up in the way that you did and in the way that others, nurses, are stepping up now. Hi everybody. I'm not usually the guy that like writes stuff down to talk, and we're supposed to be informal. But what happened when I was invited to this was, you know, it really just took me back in time, and it got me just sitting writing. So I'll be reading a little. I'll try and be like me at the same time, and it won't be boring, I promise. One of the things that you were talking about, Dixcy, was, you know, Anthony Fauci as kind of a common person across these times. And at a task force briefing at the White House about COVID-19 recently, he was talking about how COVID-19 had shed a light on health disparities in this country and the disproportionate impact on Black people, Black Americans, and parallels to the AIDS epidemic. So I want to read what he said at that conference. At the press conference. During that time, there was an extraordinary stigma, particularly against the gay community. And it was only when the world realized how the gay community had responded to this outbreak with incredible courage and dignity and strength and activism, I think that really changed some of the stigma against the gay community, very much so. I really appreciated hearing this history recognized and honored, especially from inside the White House, as Mike Pence glowered in the background. It's my history, Dixcy's history. It's many people, I'm sure, on this call's history. And now in the midst of the anxiety and the worry, the anger, the helplessness and confusion that I've been feeling during COVID-19, I'm drawn back in time to questions that I was asking in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic in this country. To be sure, these are very different times. It's a vastly different world than the 80s and 90s, and I am not 23 anymore. And these are the questions that I was asking then, and I'm asking again now. Whose bodies will be sacrificed?
Mm-hmm.
What does it say about who we value and who we don't? What is this moment we are in? How do I understand it? What am I going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? So to these questions now and then. So whose bodies will be sacrificed? Gay men's bodies were on the line when AIDS hit the United States in 1981. We were sinners, criminals, crazy, and dangerous, as you know. This is how we were pushed to the margins, dehumanized, and made expendable the usual way. We were joined with other so-called risk groups, Haitians, IV drug users, hemophiliacs. Honestly, at the time, I felt like I was in good company. I may have looked like I just stepped out of a J. Crew catalog, but I was tired of being the best little boy in the world. And strangely, wonderfully, I really loved having common cause with people who are at risk for a disease spread through blood and semen. Growing up gay in America, the 1960s and 70s, I was pushed into the closet and I hid there in shame. The closet made parts of me invisible. And in the mid 1980s, as I was coming out joyously, excruciatingly, I was beginning to see myself and being seen. Then I felt even more invisible as the federal government offered its ineffectual non-response to HIV. When the Catholic Church blamed us and turned its back on us again. When people in my own family could not find empathy for me or my friends. Unseen, unheard, non-existent by By the end of 1987, 48,000 people in the US had died, causes related to AIDS. So today, with COVID-19, we're all at risk. Off from a sneeze, drop of spit. So scary. So many are ill and too many have died. But those at the highest risk now, whose bodies are being sacrificed, are more often the people working essential jobs, people working in supermarkets and drugstores, clerks, bus drivers, taxi drivers, delivery people, healthcare workers. All these folks more often are people of color. Whose lives do we value when we force workers back into meat packing plants? What is this moment we are in, and how do I understand it? It didn't come to me all at once, but as the AIDS epidemic went on and on, I understood that being out as a gay man was a matter of life and death. My friends were dying because of silence. The wisdom of ACT UP slogans and chants touched a chord in me and many others. Silence equals death. Your silence will not protect you. We die, they do nothing. My resolution was, I will never let anyone ever make my being gay my problem. At that time, we were able to take care of the sick and dying. And by we, I mean in addition to the doctors and the nurses, regular untrained people sat at the bedsides of people with AIDS and did all the necessary tender things that are necessary. And that strikes me as a big difference with COVID-19. The desperately sick are now attended by professional caregivers, and the professional caregivers, the nurses, the doctors, since they've stepped up, but family and friends are mostly kept away. This is the moment we are in. It's prudent, of course, for us to keep our distance, but what have we lost by not laying on hands? The bedside visuals and the funerals and the memorial service during the AIDS time were comforting rituals and big community gatherings. I remember many of them. It's just weird to think of a funeral or memorial service as like a wonderful thing, but so often they felt like parties, despite our grief. They galvanized our mutual strength and our resolve. And now that memorial services are postponed or online, what happens to our collective grief and all the confusing emotions that go with it? One big emotion that I experienced back then was anger. I was taught that anger was negative, to be denied, to be tamped down. But the rage I felt would not be tamped. It wasn't a feeling I was comfortable, initially anyway. However, when I saw it reflected in other people around me, when I got involved in ACT UP, when I sat with people living with AIDS, dying with AIDS, it helped to give it voice and let it flow. And I have a very different relationship with anger now than I did back then. And I think, Dixcy, what you were talking about, grace, like, didn't realize that was a good thing, a positive thing in and of itself. And where does it take me or us to have those strong emotions? What am I going to do about it? That was my question then. It's my question now. What are we going to do about it? I decided to step away from my job in business. I just couldn't do it anymore. Turn anger into action was one of ACT UP mottos that I decided to follow. I went back to school to get a social work degree. And while I was doing my internship at the AIDS Project in Portland, Maine, I met a woman named Franny Peabody. She was 90 years old. She had turned to AIDS activism when she had gone out to visit her grandson Peter in San Diego, and she saw that he was treated like a pariah. And she came back with fervor and ran a support group for parents, a support group with people living with AIDS for years and years. I got to know her, And then I was spending a lot of time also while I was doing my work in the AIDS project with a woman named Sandy, who was a hospice nurse. And I remember my very first client as a baby social worker was a guy named Jerry. Like gave me like the hardest person, hardest case. Very tough guy, but you know, he begged me to help him to be able to die at home. And I did everything I could. We did everything we could, but in the end, he died in the intensive care unit at the hospital. Franny, Sandy, and I agreed back then that we needed to start a hospice, a comfortable, beautiful place for people with AIDS to live their last days. We approached a man I knew a little. His name was Peter Haffenreffer, a quiet philanthropist who stayed out of the limelight, but he was known for his big heart. He didn't really need to be convinced. He heard our story and said, what we need to do now is buy a house and have people gather around something real. So that's what we did. You know, he had the means to do that. And I think for people to see something concrete just caused all kinds of people to gather. It also caused all kinds of people to oppose us, but I'm not going to get into that. So there's a lot more to that story that I don't have time to tell, but I will just tell you that Peabody House opened a year later. Lots of people joined in renovating it, preparing it. And in our first year of being opened, 17 people died in that house. I'm not sure yet what I'm going to do with all that this new epidemic has wrought. I know it will have something to do with addressing the divide between those who are most vulnerable, whose bodies are now on the line, and with the system of white supremacy, of which I am a part, and we all are a part. You know, I hear people talking about how COVID-19 has revealed health disparities, that certain groups of people, especially Black and brown people, are more vulnerable, more likely to get sick, more likely to die. And phrases like underlying health conditions and social determinants of health and lack of health insurance. And these are being revealed to us seriously. This is a revelation to us. We already knew this. Alicia's laughing and cheering. It's not a surprise, but maybe it is for some people, and that's okay too. So people's eyes are open. And even if it's old information or new information for people, we need to take action based on what we know, each in our own way, from where we are. Think about Franny Peabody at 90 years old. Oh my God, she died at 98. She was like way into this, setting up this hospice with us. She was a reluctant fundraiser like me, but you know, she and I counted the dollar bills at the bake sales and all this little fundraisers we had to do. And I think about one of my best friends, Peter Haffenreffer, the philanthropist guy. You know, he's my buddy now. We're close as can be, and he's 84 years old now. So from our own place, wherever we are, and for me, I'm still figuring it out, but I know that one of the things is that we have to figure out how to keep this physical distancing that's going on from separating us. And I think this call is one small way that we can do that. Sorry that I read. I hope you felt my heart coming through this and my passion and my experience. And I really am grateful to have the opportunity to kind of go back in time and just see the parallels and not parallels and the confusion and the question. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was beautiful. Oh my goodness. Y'all are great. Lastly, we have Rachel. Rachel, the floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. And so much gratitude to Dixcy and Chris. Thank you so much for your testimony and your years of activism. To historicize myself, I was born in 1995. So truly, I walk in your footsteps and I'm incredibly grateful for everything that you've done. I am an Asian American. I also am a historian. So when thinking about this pandemic and thinking about the ways that it has impacted the Asian American community, part of the way that I've tried to grapple with what's happening to me, what's happening to my friends, and these larger systems that Chris has rightly pointed out, the ways that we see essentialized workers, the way that we see people who don't have access to housing, and especially the way that this disease is impacting our Black and Brown communities across the United States. It can feel very overwhelming, but at the same time, it can feel very familiar. These are very, very similar patterns to what have happened in the past. One of the ways that this connects to the HIV/AIDS pandemic really clearly is that there are still a lot of cities in the United States where HIV/AIDS is present at epidemic levels. Washington, D.C. is one of those. As the rate has dropped over the last 3 years, which is really exciting, but Washington, D.C. continues to have about a 2%, 1% right in between those two HIV infection rate. This, of course, is disproportionate. A lot of the people who are most at risk of HIV/AIDS are bisexual and gay men, and specifically Black men. 1 in 7 Black men in Washington, D.C. are at risk or already have HIV/AIDS. So it's really interesting when we think about the way we talk about pandemics and epidemics, when the history stops, when we stop telling that history. For a lot of people, I think, unless you work in HIV/AIDS activism or in healthcare, you think about the story of HIV/AIDS being something that ended in the 90s. I think it's important to recognize that health issues do interlock into each other, and they can't just be left in one era. As Chris and Dixcy have also highlighted with end-of-life care, these are ongoing things that as a society we continue to neglect. We're just seeing right now that there's more strain put on the system. So all of these ongoing issues, all of the people who we continue to leave behind and not talk about in the news, these are all interlocked. These are all groups of people who continue to maintain vulnerability. My connection to COVID-19, it's hard to feel connected, right? We're all in our homes and things. It's really hard to think about conceptually and ideologically how you can connect to something when you are being tasked with staying away from each other. Activism looks so different now for COVID-19 because we have to physically distance each other. But I personally have experienced anti-Asian sentiment while living in Honolulu. In my ignorance, I was very surprised by that. I just moved here in the last year, and because the population is so heavily Asian American, I had heard reports of other places in the United States experiencing anti-Asian racism. To contextualize this, because the disease was first reported in Wuhan, China, and because we do have an executive branch that continues to refer to the disease as the China virus, or the Kung flu has been used by people in government offices fairly frequently, we can directly correlate what the White House discourse is to rises in violence against minority groups. This is also historically true. This isn't just true for Asian Americans. Throughout the current presidency, we've seen how whenever the White House executive branch says anything about particularly like the Jewish community, or that's the first example that comes to mind, but whenever a marginalized group comes up in White House discourse, violence also rises along with that discourse spreading. On my own part, I was walking with a friend who also lives alone. I have a social distance friend, and we stand on other sides of the street and we go on walks together because we both live alone. You got to find a way to break up the isolation throughout the week. So masks on, walking through town. I live about a mile from Waikiki Beach, that whole spread, which is very spooky right now. It's completely empty. Few businesses are open, but all the tourists have been asked to abstain coming here until at least June. So beaches are empty. It's mostly just locals, so lots of joggers, lots of surfers, no one else is here. But even in those empty streets, even in that space of isolation and distance, one of the few interactions I've had with strangers since this has happened was a man ran at me and spit at me and was yelling at me for being Chinese. Of course, I don't have to explain why that's wrong, but part of me still tried to contextualize it. I'm Hapa, so I'm half white, and I'm also Japanese Korean. I'm not Chinese at all. So interestingly, I know other people have probably had this experience. When you face openly racist, openly discriminatory action, the first thing you feel is shock. So you stand there and you immediately think about, where should my body be? How can I get away from this? And then after that, I tried to just intellectualize it. I was like, that doesn't even make sense. I don't think I look Chinese. I've never been called Chinese before in my life. This, of course, is just the absurdity of racism and discrimination. It doesn't matter what the logic is. It doesn't matter who you actually are or what your connection actually is to the disease. Racism and oppression just overall essentializes a group of people. So if you look like you could be Chinese, your risk of being out in public and being harassed right now is a lot higher. This unfortunately is a nationally spread chain. I know over 1,000 reports in early April came in and were publicized about people experiencing anti-Asian racism. However, I want to point to that when you see this in the news, know that a lot of people aren't reporting. It can be really scary for minority groups to interact with law enforcement. Historically, there's a reason why people of color do not want to interact with law enforcement. So note too that, kind of like our COVID-19 reporting, whatever you see in the news, acknowledge that this is a larger issue, and there's probably a lot of stories that we don't understand and see. And with the rest of my time too, I do want to talk about larger discriminatory issues, and that'll really link into things that Chris was already asking for us to be mindful of. We have seen how the death rates of COVID-19 are directly impacting Black Americans more than any other group of people. The other group I want to acknowledge too is Indigenous peoples. The Navajo tribe have experienced larger death rates than most cities, most states. And a lot of this is being racialized to reflect the group's health awareness and cleanliness and things like that. That, of course, is not the case. We can see historically over time how groups like Black Americans and Indigenous people specifically have been withheld proper health care. They have not been given access to our highly privatized healthcare system in the same way that white Americans have. The other thing I want to point out too is we have a long history of incarceration in the United States. Within incarceration, there is a huge lack of access to not only healthcare, but other things that are really crucial to preventing COVID-19 in particular. Thinking about space and privacy, having your own air to breathe, things like that are not available, especially within incarcerated spaces. When we think about groups that are highly likely to be targeted, Asian American history overlaps a lot with immigrant history. Discrimination against Asian Americans has often been because they are seen as outsiders that are coming in and taking jobs. We share a lot of that history with Latinx communities. So Latino, Latina communities, especially in places along the US-Mexico border. But of course, you know, racism travels beyond borders. This is something that has culturally been pervasive throughout the United States and US history. So thinking about both incarcerated history and the history of immigrant experiences of discrimination, we can see where like ICE detainment centers are becoming a huge place of concern. We've already seen higher spreads of COVID-19 within ICE incarceration centers and in prisons. Just a few statistics to help tie this all together, and then I'll be out of everyone's hair. But when we look at the police interventions that have happened in big cities like New York City in regards to enforcing shelter in place, this was 2 weekends ago, so the statistic's a little bit old, but out of the 40 arrests that were made in Manhattan against people who were not following social distance procedures, 35 of them were Black people. 4 of them were Latinx. Only 1 person was arrested in the first weekend of the parks being open that was white in all of Manhattan. And I think we've all seen the pictures of Sheep's Meadow and Central Park. You know, the Black bodies are not the only bodies by any means that are stepping outside of their homes. If anything, we can look at the protests right now and we can start to see which groups of people are actively and openly stepping outside of their homes when they don't have to. Also, too, in Chicago, about 40%, or about 1/3, wait, I'm getting the statistics mixed up. I'm sorry. About 1/3 of the city of Chicago is Black. About 70% of the deaths so far in Chicago have been Black bodies. So this is another way that we can immediately see the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 onto Black and Brown communities, following these historic trends of marginalization and displacement. I love that Chris and Dixcy were thinking about things we can do, ways that we can support each other. Here in Hawaii, we have the highest rate of intergenerational homes. So a lot of people are already living intergenerationally here, which is also a reason why we've been very, very concerned about COVID-19 as a state. One of the things we have here, we do have a hotline for just calling our elders, our kapuna, people who are 65 plus and live alone. So that's one thing to look into. I'm not sure if Washington, D.C. has similar things, but there's ways that phone banking and new technology like Zoom, things that weren't in the same iteration during the HIV/AIDS pandemic, can help us to still stay connected to each other, even though the world view, the view of activism right now is just so different. Our ways to organize are so different. Other things you can do too, I really believe that things like racism, things like homophobia, they really start in conversations. They don't necessarily start just because you had one interaction with one member of one minority and all of a sudden your worldview was like forever violently changed. I really do think that conversations you have day to day with your relatives, with people that you work with, that's kind of where you can make the most change. So think too about raising questions like the ones we've been raising today, just as you have conversations with other people that surround you. Oftentimes who are close to us, kind of like the examples that were shared before, that's where you have the biggest impact. That's where you can really change a life. So as you think about ways that you can interject into the way we talk about this virus and the ways that we understand who it's impacting, I encourage everyone to step up and share what they know. And if you don't know, but you feel like there might be something off, just ask a lot of questions. I feel like that's always a really good way to start a discourse and continue the conversation. All right, thank you so much for having me, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. Thank you to all of our presenters, all of your stories, everything you said. It was just very beautiful to hear, and it really has got my wheels turning. Also, like, I wanted to cry at some moments because I'm like, oh my gosh. So thank you for taking me on an emotional journey. Now we're going to open the space for some questions. So if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask to the group. Yes.
Well, I'll start. I don't have a question specifically. I want to thank the speakers, first of all, for presenting their stories. I'm very much, I think, like several of them, all in a mixture, in that I took care of my first patient with AIDS in 1982 when I was a fireman. And I have the notion of being the first openly gay professional firefighter in the United States. So here I was, a professional firefighter, and what comes along but this disease. So what I did on my days off at the firehouse was volunteer in hospice. So I really appreciate those of you who put together these different kinds of facilities to provide alternate care systems to people, because so little of that existed. I mean, hospice was really new in the early 80s. At least it was in Florida. But it was the volunteering at hospice and other experiences where I eventually, years later, left the fire department to become a nurse. And so I've been a nurse since the mid-80s, and I've always focused on AIDS. So much like you were talking about the seeing the nurses on TV in these last 3 months, oh, I know just what they're going through. I worked on the Hopkins AIDS unit for years, and I was there about 3.5 years on the Hopkins dedicated AIDS unit in the early 90s. And when between the time I was hired and the time I left in 3.5 years, we'd had 1,100 deaths on that ward. And I remember days when you just got back from the morgue and you had another patient coming in to take the empty bed. So I could see what these nurses and doctors are dealing with now. thank Chris very much for saying exactly what I would have said, and I'm sure a lot of you were thinking, was we really needed this to show us where the disparities were. You know, did we not learn anything over the last 40 years about who are the people who are most at risk and most at risk for not getting good care, for not getting access to care, and not getting appropriate care. So I would add one other, now I'm sorry I missed a bunch of the talk there because our power went out for a few minutes, but one of the groups that I've worked with is deaf and hard of hearing people, and trying to get them to get information about HIV and about their own protective practices. There are so many groups that are at such high risk because they don't get good information, they don't get understandable information. So I appreciate all of that. There are some things that can be done, and I think there are some things that have changed. I tend to watch NBC News in the evening at 7 o'clock and with Lester Holt. And one of the things I did notice this time with through this pandemic is that each night they would highlight generally 4 or 5 people who died that day from, or maybe the day before, of COVID. And I was very impressed that they did not just focus on famous people. They talked about a bus driver in New Jersey, and they talked about a cafeteria worker in Texas. And that kind of humanization, I think, has been really important to really focus on, to help, because I think humanization is really the whole thing. As someone said, you know, who is it that's dying and who's expendable? I have buried partners and certainly far too many friends to mention. And as you can probably tell by my background, I spent the last 15 years doing work in sub-Saharan Africa with HIV and nurses. And it might not surprise you to know, but when I started my major program in 3 African countries in 2006, there was not a single program on grief, bereavement, or trauma for either the community or the nurses. And so that was part of what I started in these countries that I was funded to be in, was developing an intervention to help the healthcare worker to manage all of this loss that they were facing day after day after day, and they still do to this day. It's just now more tuberculosis than it is HIV. So I appreciate the conversation, which is why I was excited when I got this email, because there are so many similarities. There are differences, but there are so many similarities. And when I watch the people who are demonstrating to open up, bring everything back again, I can understand that financial crisis. I can understand that burden. But I would imagine a bunch of those people also just want to get their hair cut and make their nails nice, you know, and maybe not thinking so much, who is it that's dying? And maybe it was said when I was off screen there for a little bit, I'm 64 years old. Well, I'm one of those people who's likely to die if I get COVID. I have terrible asthma and a heart condition. And I wonder, gee, does anybody value that? Because people are older, that those are the people who are dying, and they are Black and they are brown. So anyway, mostly to say I enjoyed the conversation. It was really great listening to the 3 of you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else have anything that they would like to share or questions that they have?
I would like to thank all the presenters, and that as a long-term survivor going on 25 years, I was really struck by this conversation. And as far as I can tell, on the national level, there's a little conversation about long-term survivors and what we're going through with this. But there is no conversation on the local level here in DC. and talking about the trauma that the early days, and finding out that we are positive and that we're not going to live very long. And then 25 years later, we're still here. But it's opened up all this trauma of, how to survive, and with all the death on the timelines and that. So I hope that this won't be the last conversation. I hope it's the beginning of a new conversation that we need to have with long-term survivors, and how do we make it through this process. I know,
George, if you would like, I published a article back in the, I guess it's 90s now, which specifically spoke to, at that time we were talking about grief more than we were trauma. The grief experiences of HIV positive people and their survivors. But it really started with the idea that I knew lots of people who were surviving HIV, but were dealing with so much of the trauma that it affected them. And I'd be more than happy to share that with anybody that wants it. I'm sorry, I'm a researcher now, and I publish a bunch, so. But that's why my research has all been on how do we get through that trauma? How do we manage? And the nurses I worked with in Africa, by and large, a third of them were living with HIV while they were taking care of all these people living with HIV.
Wow.
I was working in the countries with the highest HIV rates in the world.
But to continue my thought, though, is we need these continued conversations, and we need to talk more about mental health of it. I know that I am now doing weekly telehealth medicine with my therapist, and from home. So that's really helping me. But I think that us having these type of conversations where we talk as long-term survivors with each other to say, this is something that I'm going through, and this could help you, or I can get it, give and accept advice. And I'll just end it there.
Thank you so much, George. I completely agree with what you're saying of needing more spaces to share experiences. So thank you so much for that. Would anyone else like to share or ask a question? Sonia, go ahead. Let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. I think one of the things that hasn't been discussed at all here is the essential workers, and the fact that it is those people who are essential workers in grocery stores who are picking up the groceries for people like me, and who are particularly vulnerable on many counts, both because of income, their own living conditions, their own health conditions, and the people who are, for example, being called to work in meat plants, in terrible places. Do I eat meat or not? And how are those essential workers being compensated? They're not being compensated for the risk that they're taking. They're basically, I almost look at that as slavery. They have no choice. They're going to eat. They have to, work. So I think that's a really big missing thing that we've missed, not just here, but it's generally has been missed. And that is, as a society and as individuals, what do we do?
Absolutely, Sonia. Thank you for bringing that up. I do think, though, that a lot of the patterns of who are essential workers lines up with other patterns that we have talked about.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it's really crucial that you brought up that connection, because it is really easy to forget when we order takeout or we send someone to the grocery store who's running. I've used Instacart 1 or 2 times because I was scared to go to the grocery store after I got yelled at in public. But after a while, I started deciding to go again because I am able-bodied right now and I don't have any underlying conditions. But that was something that I had to realize. And I think I think this is a particular opportunity for all of us to think about our shopping habits. Absolutely, Sonia. I think it's so crucial to think about where we get what we get and what is an essential item. I did see an interview with some Amazon shipping employees, complaining about all the sex toys that they are having to come in and ship. And that was the direct quote. It was a bigger issue of having to ship all of these really absurd, silly, like board games, things like that. Like things that aren't necessarily food or survival items. And the way that he summed it up, he was just like, I don't want to risk my life to come in here and ship you 10 dildos. So I do think that is such an important thing to also not only acknowledge, but to think about as a personal habit. Because we all contribute to capitalistic disparities when we shop. And now it's being laid bare in a way that we haven't seen before. That's so crucial.
Thank you so much.
I would love...
Some of us were in that vulnerable population.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would really love to hear thoughts and recommendations for how we support people who are grieving right now. It's something I've been very concerned about from the beginning, this sense of people losing people without having that contact with them, and how that's going to affect people going forward. Being unable to travel to even be close to someone, family members who are ill and dying. And also about, I'm just so appreciative of the conversation, and trying to think about, how do we turn the tables? How do we remind everybody that the people who are dying do have value? That all of these people matter. Black lives matter, older lives matter. All of these, and just sort of trying to think, kind of concretely about, okay, here's today. What do we do today? What do we do tomorrow? How do we make that difference?
I think one of the, Rachel, you may have said it, I'm not sure, but a lot of this stuff starts with conversations. So I think that those of us who have a little bit more awareness about what's going on, and certainly have some perspective from another pandemic, one of the ways that we really made it through the AIDS epidemic, now some of us pushed our way through, but we also got all of these movies and plays and things to tell the stories and humanize people. And it changed a lot of Americans' points of view. I think one of the reasons we got marriage is because so many gay men died. Parents really thought, I'd much rather have a happy married son than a dead son. I think it changed people's view to have these stories. I think we need to tell stories. We're not going to have a lot of opportunity, not a lot of it, face to face for quite a while here. So we're going to have to find a lot of different ways. I'm thrilled that there are so many artists putting things up on YouTube and Facebook and other places that are really compassionate and thoughtful. And but I think one of the things each of us needs to do, and Rachel certainly hit it on the head, is we need to advocate in whatever ways we can. I'm a nurse. I'm very involved on the national level with my nursing organizations, and we give them feedback all the time as to what policy should be. And luckily, my profession is very nimble. The nursing professionals will get a letter to the White House in a week. They'll move fast. But we need to speak up and say, this is what we know, and this is what needs to be done to reach out. But I think storytelling as well, that when you see a story that makes a difference to you, share that story with someone else. And you're communicating inclusiveness and access and respect. And I very much agree with Judy, being a grief and bereavement person as I am. I just cannot imagine the pain people are going through when they can't go into the hospital and watch their husband, wife, lover die, or their child. So we need to find ways that we're going to be able to communicate. And of course, the Village is one of those venues in which we can at least have a little bit more connection. But I think this kind of venue has really been quite nice for me today. Other ways people think that we can act and do something?
I'm so grateful for the connection to mental health that everybody has brought up, because that really is, that's fundamental for us organizing or doing anything. It's really difficult to not only face the direct grief of losing someone during this, but the cultural grief of just every element of life fundamentally changing. This is a really traumatic amount of change for not only us, but every single person that we interact with. So I think speaking to that is really important. I think being open and honest about not being well is really important. And I feel like we might be beating the horse again, but communication is so crucial. Just sending a text to someone as you think about them, even if you don't know if they're going to read it. Asking people, I've straight up, I live alone. So I have just outright asked my friends, like, hey, if you don't hear from me for a couple days, can you check in on me? My mental health has not been great. And also thinking about who in your life might be alone, especially. Organizing amongst your own community, organizing amongst your own network is foundational in order to be able to have the energy to do the other amazing things that are great for organizing. So if you have the energy to call your representatives, if you have the energy to plug into some town halls, I know Zoom has been amazing, not only for this, like I would have never been part of this community elsewhere in my life. Let alone during COVID-19, but the digital opportunities to meet new people and to find people that care about the same things have opened up a lot more, actually, because of COVID-19. There's some really fascinating ways that new communities are building. So first and foremost, like vulnerability, asking people that you love and trust to hold you accountable, and just starting some like daily conversations with someone that you love. So important to fueling up and taking care of yourself. And then from there, starting to brainstorm with people who are like-minded about what you can do next. It's not only going to be good for you day to day, but I do think that is the foundation for us mobilizing in the future. So important, you guys.
I just thought I might add a little to that, Judy, because when you were asking your question, I was thinking about a friend of mine who died 2 days ago, and his widow, who is a dear friend, and in a different world, different time, I'd just jump in my car and drive to Charlottesville and sit with her, and bring a chocolate cake. Because I it's kind of pathetic, or I don't know what, but I think we got pretty good at grieving and comforting each other during the AIDS epidemic, and so much of it was about just sitting together and standing on the precipice with your friend or your whoever, eating. Honest to God, food always has been a funeral, ham, and I just remember Irish wakes when I was growing up. So a lot of those things that we got good at, that are sort of my instincts when that happens, are not available to me now. And so I've been thinking, the same kind of thing, like, should I send a text? Well, I remember when my mom died, the texts were a little intrusive in a moment. So I decided, I'm not saying this is your answer, but like one small thing that I thought about, which connects with what other folks have said before me, is I'm going to write a note. I'm going to go old school. It's going to be short, but my friend can open the note when she wants to. And then I won't be able to put any chocolate cake in there. But one of the things that I remember about what was so important about memorial services is remembering that person, which, is about, literally remembering. So this person is still a member of our community, and is a member of this inner circle, and is still loved on some spiritual plane, this person. So I think my note will be pretty short, but it really is going to be about how this man who died is still connected and with my friend Lois, and how Lois is still connected to him, and what I remember about him, and what I remember about them together, and also how he and she touched me and you know, been a part of my life. So I think it's a small thing, but it's a parallel to what I think is such an important task of grieving, is to come together as a community, and the person's maybe gone in some way, but they're not. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I've really been puzzling this through myself. So I just thought I would offer that.
Thank you, Chris. I definitely echo what Chris is saying about like going back to basics, like writing letters and doing things that we did pre-technology and pre-everything. So just getting back to really knowing people and connecting with people in a different way, because I really do feel like this virus is forcing us to connect back to how we used to, because we're used to sending a quick text and then going off and doing something and thinking about something else. But having to sit down and think about how this person has impacted your life, how you have impacted their life, I think is so much more connected than we used to be. So I really appreciate what everyone is saying. I want to give some, if folks have some last minute thoughts and questions, we can do that, maybe one or two more. And then I want to give space for everyone to go do what they want to do for the rest of their Friday. But Katie, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to echo the gratitude for Dixcy, Chris, and Rachel for sharing so vulnerably your own experience and how that is happening, kind of playing out in today's context. One of the things that you said that caught me early on, Dixcy, was this idea of this intense pain and loss bringing forth sort of an intense period of grace and gratitude. And that's something that personally, and I believe that I've been, trying to make space for myself and hold sacred. And also I'm encouraging, members I work with and anyone I talk with to think about this idea of us as being, I use the word infinite, which might be a little too woo-woo for some people, but this idea that we can be both really sad and be holding space for the things of our own personal losses, thinking about the ways that there are so many experiences of folks who are disadvantaged and how I'm benefiting from some of those experiences, and the shame or the guilt or the horrible taste in my mouth that leaves, and also feel really thankful for my health, for the fact that I am continuing to hold a job, that the village is we're still up and running, whereas many people have lost jobs. There's this aspect, I think, especially in the age of social media, where it's like, it's black and white. So someone's like, oh, I'm really having a hard day at work today. And someone shoots back and says, well, at least you have a job, or there's all this at least, or you should. And I think that that's been so pervasive in our culture. And right now, this is giving us an opportunity to sit back and reflect that, like, I feel all of these things. And grief really opens us up to that. Grief opens us up to this multitude of experiences. And I think part of that is being able to for us to allow, we have this saying in my family when it comes to grief, which we've been through a lot of, is like, we're going to have different experiences, and I've got to allow that person to have their experience, and they've got to allow me to have my experience. We're not going to feel it the same way, and that is A-okay. And I really am feeling that, like I'm thinking that a lot these days. And I think part of being able to have these spaces and conversations, like you said, Michael, right? Mallinson? I know it says R. Mallinson.
Oh, it's Kevin.
Kevin, I'm sorry.
My middle name's Kevin.
I knew it was an R. That's all I could remember. But what you were saying about, having spaces and what can we do? And I think part of it is growing community and making the space available. And part of it is our own internal self-work and connecting with telehealth, mental health, like George said, or, making sure we're going back to basics or whatever it is. I think we're really being asked in this time of, survival. And I say that not just in physical survival, but sort of, spiritual and emotional survival and perseverance through this, to think about our own selves and be able to hold multiple selves at the same time. And it's not something that is easy. and I'm excited isn't the right word, but I look forward to uncovering more ways that we can do it as a community and then kind of go back and do it individually too. And I appreciate this space so much, and I'd love to see these conversations continue in some way or shape or form at the Village or the DC Villages overall. George, we can talk, more about how we can partner in that, but I totally agree.
Thank you, Katie. Again, I want to thank all of our panelists today, Dixcy, Chris, Rachel. It was very amazing and very touching to hear your stories and the work that you have done in your communities. I want to thank all the participants who took time out of their day to listen in and share your thoughts. I do hope that we can have programming like this in the future, and that you all see this, that we are in this together, and that we are, even if you are not a part of the Village, you are a part of the Village, and we want you to do well, and we are here for you. So again, thank you all. If you have questions, feel free to email me. If you need anything, feel free to email me, and thank you all, and I hope you have a great Friday.
I'd like to thank you, Alicia, for helping put this together, and Katie too. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you all.
Thank
It was
you.
a pleasure. Take care.
Nice being with you.